Tell us what's on your radar, Kim.
Take a look at this Politico article. Ottawa truckers' convoy galvanizes far-right worldwide. Leading Republicans, right-wing influencers, and white supremacist groups have jumped at the chance to promote the standoff in Ottawa to a global audience. Now, we've heard this claim many times throughout the duration of the Trucker Freedom Convoy in Canada that these protests are a bunch of racist, swastika-waving white supremacists. And now Politico and others are claiming the racist movement has spread around the globe. The article says, on multiple crowdfunding platforms, people from around the globe, often directed to the cause by American far-right influencers like Dan Bongino and Ben Shapiro, have collectively donated millions of dollars in support of the Canadian movement and started similar crowdfunding campaigns for like-minded protests in U.S. states and European countries. Now, first, I want to be clear that the term far-right is derogatory because it implies racism and bigotry. It's mostly associated with being a white supremacist or white nationalist or having views that border along those lines, and that's what people essentially mean when they call someone or something far right. They're usually implying white nationalism and racism. In fact, Urban Dictionary says the phrase basically means modern-day Nazis. So when Politico calls Dan Bongino and Ben Shapiro far right, rather than just labeling them conservative or Republican, they're implying something very dark and sinister. They're insinuating that Ben Shapiro, a devout Jewish man, is somehow connected to modern-day Nazis. Now listen, I've listened to Ben Shapiro, and he's definitely a conservative Republican, and I don't agree with him on much. But labeling him far right with the implication of being connected to white nationalists is a lazy ad hominem and piss-poor dishonest journalism. But let's get back to the protests. Let's take a look at these protests Politico is claiming to be filled and fueled with far-right white supremacists. Let's take a look at Israel. The country requires 4 doses to be considered fully vaccinated, amongst many other restrictions, and the Israeli people seem to have had enough. Thousands gathered throughout the country to protest against the mandates. The Israeli press estimated that about 30,000 cars from 40 different cities joined in Monday on a route from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. They had their own convoy, a Canadian-inspired one. Now, one thing you won't read in Israeli news about these protests is the claim that they're filled with far-right, racist, swastika-waving white nationalists. And I think it's obvious why that wouldn't be accurate or honest reporting. I don't think I need to explain it. Now, protests have also cropped up all around Europe. Truckers and other motorists, mostly from the Netherlands and France, as well as Italy and Portugal, attempted to assemble a convoy from various points in Europe to meet up in Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union. However, as the protests were forming and gaining steam, France and Brussels preempted the convoys by making motorized protests illegal and threatening people with 2 years in prison. Now, maybe you could attempt to make the claim that the European freedom protests are filled with far-right white nationalists, but take a look at the protests that happened this week in New Zealand. Those chanting protesters right there, those are Maori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand, doing a tribal chant. They were there before the white European colonizers came in, and they're all over New Zealand's anti-mandate protests. So it's going to be difficult to make the case that the indigenous people of New Zealand, who were ultimately colonized and had their land and children stolen by white Europeans, are racist, swastika-waving white nationalists. It's usually the other way around. So when the media and others on social make the claim that these protests are fueled by far-right fringe white supremacists, remember that they are talking about Jews here in the U.S. and in Israel and indigenous Maori people in New Zealand. Either the definition of far-right white supremacists has been greatly expanded, or they're doing everything they can to demonize a legitimate uprising of working-class people from all backgrounds. But my big question is why? Why would the media be demonizing these protests and always labeling them as far right, which we know what that means? It's a derogatory term. Why are they I mean, what is the motivation? I'm trying to wrap my mind around it, and I can't figure it out.
I mean, that's how you get people to tune out what the message is, right? There's no more damning thing you can say about someone or a movement than racist or white supremacist.
But why would these organizations want to delegitimize? I mean, what is the motivation for Politico, for example, to say, oh yeah, all these protesters are just far right white nationalists? I mean, what is the motivation? Why do it?
I think part of it goes back to the way that I talked was it yesterday about how this framing is so damaging for the left because it makes it impossible for the left to talk to the people who are galvanized into these protests and then to tell them your anger is right and righteous and here are the people that you should be angry at and direct them there because you're not going to be able to kind of snuff out the anger. And it seems like the media would prefer to just snuff it out and pretend that anger's not there. But what they end up doing is they channel it to right-wing groups who are smart enough to actually kind of take advantage of these. So you do have right-wing organizers who get involved in these protests because they see it as an opportunity to turn out this movement in their direction. Which that's political organizing. That's what you do. But
I mean, do we know that these protests are being organized by Republican Party or right wing?
Not necessarily organized, but say right wing media is much more likely to elevate them than mainstream or progressive media is. Well, that's what reporting does.
Well, and then eventually to associate themselves with it. I mean, we saw that. They do that with every story in which the media has unfairly maligned. Like they made, like Kyle Rittenhouse is now like a sort of conservative hero, right? He's speaking at CPAC because he gets embraced after a legitimate case of the media kind of misrepresenting the information about it. There's a lot of ignorance about what the case actually involved, and I think he was rightly acquitted, et cetera. And then, but because everything has to be on one side or the other, then he gets put in with that side, and that's what's happening with the trucker people. They're being positioned, they're being pushed to be associated with the right because you're not allowed. You have to be with the right, or you have to be with the left media, progressive, democratic world, but that world will not have these people here. So it's just got to be one or the other.
Right. We have a tribal politics that says you must be on one side or the other. You can't be just a group of people who are upset about X, Y, or Z. You must pick a side. And people are like, well, why do I have to pick a side? Well, you have to pick a side.
So the media has to ignore confounding variables or things that would make it harder to associate a group with one side. They have to just, like the fact that these are working class people, or these were not most of them politically active people before. They have to go, no, don't talk about that. Talk about how there was maybe like 2 Nazi signs somewhere. Talk about how, the discernible right-wing agenda we can attach to them. Talk about that kind of thing. Find their most extreme anti-vaccines working position and elevate that. That's how they work to smooth out those issues.
Right, and the parallel would be that why the Obama to Trump voter was so confounding for the narrative and wasn't something that people really wanted to unpack or grapple with. Because that really does confound and complicate the argument that all of the Trump voters were racist if some of them had been voters for Barack Obama in both cycles before that. And so it's easier to just ignore that. But part of it is this social political realignment that we've talked about a lot on here that is around education, where the center-left parties around the world, and Thomas Piketty was a French economist, done some really great work on this, that across the world, center-left parties have become dominated by highly educated people, and center-right parties have become dominated by people with less education. And so people who are in the media are these highly educated center-leftist people, and whether they've read their Piketty or not, they've intuitively understood this evolution of our politics. And so when they look out and they see working class people, that now codes to them as center right or right wing. And that's a disaster for the left.
Yeah. I still, with these media organizations picking sides, I mean, that is still, it's like, I guess because they don't want to lose their subscribers or their donors or I don't know if advertisers seem to care as much which side people, Fox News makes plenty of money, so does CNN. So, I'm not sure if that matters as much as maybe the subscription model or the donor model into these news organizations.
But also, it's something you've talked about before too. It's less left-right. It's more elite populist, and the media is elite. The media is not left. The media is liberal. And what the media wants to do is to kind of snuff this out. They don't actually want to redirect truckers' anger where it ought to be directed at the elites. They are the elites. Yeah. And so the only thing left for them is to say, okay, yeah, these are right-wing people.
Well, and the largest convoy outside of Canada at the time so far has been in Israel. So they are going to have a very difficult time, which is why we haven't seen any real reporting on the convoy in Israel. It's because if they're going to paint the narrative of Canadians flying swastikas and saying that that's what these people are, how are you going to point to a bunch of Jewish Israelis and say that about them?
Well, what I would say to that point, and disagree with you there, and say that yes, they're not white supremacist far right wingers in Israel, but there is a massive faction of ethno supremacist far right wingers within the Israel body politic. So
yeah, but that spans both sides of the aisle over there. I think that's a little bit of a different political and
speaking of Nazi type people, did you guys see I saw people talking about this on Twitter yesterday. I was actually going to suggest it as a topic. Forgot. Some of the Ukrainian, a group training the Ukrainian resistance, but and it was getting all this praise, but it's a Nazi group.
Right.
It's an explicitly Nazi group. It's being praised in the media. Oh, look, isn't this cool? Yeah, rah, Ukrainian resistance fighters. No, those are Nazis.
Right, no, actual Nazis.
Those are actual Nazis.
Right, actual Nazis, right.
Yeah. Freedom fighters.
Crazy.
Fun stuff. All right, thank you, Kim. And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.